Long before Britain became a global empire, this island was home to ancient Celtic tribes who built mysterious monuments like Stonehenge and developed sophisticated cultures across the land. These early Britons lived in hill forts, practiced druidism, and created intricate metalwork that still amazes archaeologists today. In 55 BC, Julius Caesar first set foot on British shores, launching 2 expeditions that marked Rome's initial interest in this distant island. However, it wasn't until 43 AD under Emperor Claudius that the Romans truly conquered Britain, beginning nearly 4 centuries of occupation that would transform the island forever. The Romans brought revolutionary changes to Britain. They constructed Hadrian's Wall to keep out the fierce Picts of Scotland, built roads that connected every corner of the province, and established cities like Londinium, modern London. Roman engineering gave Britain its first stone buildings, hypocaust heating systems, and aqueducts that supplied fresh water to growing urban centers. Roman culture deeply influenced British society. Latin became the language of administration and learning, while Roman law, religion, and customs spread throughout the conquered territories. The Romans introduced new crops, improved agricultural techniques, and established a monetary economy that replaced the barter systems of Celtic tribes. But Rome's grip on Britain was never absolute. Queen Boudicca's rebellion in 60 AD saw Celtic warriors burn London, Colchester, and St. Albans to the ground, killing thousands of Romans and their collaborators. Though ultimately defeated, her uprising demonstrated that the native spirit of resistance never fully died under Roman rule. As the Roman Empire began to crumble in the 4th century, Britain found itself increasingly isolated from the Mediterranean world. In 410 AD, Emperor Honorius told the Britons to look to their own defenses, effectively abandoning the province. The Romans left behind roads, walls, and cities, but also a power vacuum that would soon be filled by new invaders from across the North Sea. With Rome's departure, Britain entered what was once called the Dark Ages, though modern historians recognize this period as far more complex and dynamic than previously thought. Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, began settling in eastern and southern England, initially as mercenaries hired by Romano-British leaders, but soon as conquerors establishing their own kingdoms. By 600 AD, 7 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had emerged: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, and Sussex. This period, known as the Heptarchy, saw constant warfare between these kingdoms as each sought supremacy over the others. Kings like Offa of Mercia built massive earthworks. Offa's dyke still marks the Welsh border today, while others established the first English legal codes and royal courts. The arrival of Christianity in 597 AD, when Augustine landed in Kent, transformed Anglo-Saxon culture. Monasteries became centers of learning and literacy, preserving classical knowledge while developing a distinctly English Christian tradition. The epic poem Beowulf and the writings of the Venerable Bede showcase the sophisticated literature and scholarship of this supposedly dark age. In 793 AD, Viking longships struck Lindisfarne Monastery, beginning 2.5 centuries of Norse raids and settlement. These weren't just random attacks. The Vikings established the Danelaw across northern and eastern England, founding cities like York and establishing trade networks that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. The greatest Anglo-Saxon king, Alfred of Wessex, emerged as the only English ruler to successfully resist Viking conquest. Defeating the Great Heathen Army in 878 AD, Alfred not only saved his kingdom, but began the reconquest of the Danelaw. He established a navy, reformed law codes, promoted education, and earned his title Alfred the Great, the only English monarch ever to receive this honor. Alfred's successors continued his work, and by 950 AD, England was largely unified under West Saxon rule. However, a second wave of Viking attacks in the late 10th century, led by Svein Forkbeard and his son Canute, briefly made England part of a North Sea empire. The Anglo-Saxon period ended in 1066, when Harold Godwinson fell at Hastings, marking the last successful invasion of England. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 represents one of history's most decisive moments. William the Conqueror's victory didn't just change England's ruling class, it fundamentally transformed English society, language, and culture. The Norman conquest brought French-speaking nobles who built massive stone castles and cathedrals that still dominate the English landscape today. William revolutionized English governance through the feudal system, where land ownership was tied to military service. The Domesday Book of 1086, history's most comprehensive medieval survey, recorded every village, manor, and resource in England. This Norman efficiency in administration would become a hallmark of English governance for centuries to come. The 12th and 13th centuries saw England's greatest medieval expansion. Under Henry II, the Angevin Empire stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, making the English king more powerful in France than the French king himself. However, this period also witnessed the beginning of England's long conflict with France and the struggle between crown and nobility that would define medieval politics. King John's disastrous reign led to Magna Carta in 1215, a document that limited royal power and established principles that would later influence constitutional government worldwide. Though initially a practical solution to a political crisis, Magna Carta became a symbol of the rule of law and individual rights that resonates to this day. The 14th century brought unprecedented challenges. The Black Death killed 1/3 of England's population, fundamentally altering social structures as labor shortages gave peasants unprecedented bargaining power. The 100 Years' War with France drained royal treasuries while creating a new sense of English national identity, especially after victories like Crécy and Agincourt. Religious and social upheaval marked the late medieval period. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw ordinary people march on London, demanding an end to serfdom, while religious reformer John Wycliffe challenged church authority by translating the Bible into English. The Wars of the Roses between York and Lancaster from 1455 to 1485 devastated the noble class, ending only when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field, establishing the dynasty that would transform England into a global power. The Tudor dynasty transformed England from a war-torn medieval kingdom into a unified nation poised for global expansion. Henry VII ended the Wars of the Roses and established financial stability. But it was his son Henry VIII who would revolutionize English history through his dramatic break with Rome. Driven initially by his desire for a male heir, Henry VIII's 6 marriages became legendary, but his establishment of the Church of England had far more profound consequences. The dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541 not only broke papal authority, but redistributed vast wealth to the crown and nobility, creating a new Protestant establishment with vested interests in opposing Catholic restoration. The brief reign of Henry's daughter, Mary I, who attempted to restore Catholicism through persecution that earned her the nickname Bloody Mary, was followed by Elizabeth I's accession in 1558. The Elizabethan age represents one of England's greatest cultural and political achievements, combining religious settlement, economic growth, and artistic flowering. Elizabeth's 45-year reign established England as a major European power. Her defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 not only protected English independence, but marked Spain's decline as the dominant naval force. This victory opened the seas to English exploration and trade, while simultaneously strengthening Protestant identity and national confidence. The Elizabethan era witnessed an unprecedented cultural renaissance. William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser created literature that remains central to English-speaking culture. The Globe Theatre, courtly music, and architectural innovations like the great houses of Burghley and Hardwick Hall reflected a society growing in wealth, confidence, and sophistication. Elizabeth's court became a center of learning and diplomatic activity. She skillfully played European powers against each other while encouraging privateers like Francis Drake to attack Spanish treasure fleets. Her religious settlement, while not satisfying extremists on either side, provided the stability necessary for England's emergence as a commercial and maritime power. The Queen's decision to remain unmarried, the Virgin Queen, became part of her political strategy and mystique. However, her death in 1603 ended the Tudor line, leading to the union of English and Scottish crowns under James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, setting the stage for the next chapter in British history. The Stuart dynasty began with James I's peaceful accession in 1603, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland for the first time. However, James's belief in the divine right of kings and his attempts to rule without parliament created tensions that would eventually explode into civil war. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605, though it failed, heightened religious anxieties and paranoia about Catholic conspiracies. Charles I's reign proved even more controversial. His attempts to rule without parliament for 11 years, his marriage to a Catholic princess, and his religious policies alienated both Puritans and traditional Protestants. When financial necessity forced him to recall Parliament in 1640, the accumulated grievances could no longer be contained. The English Civil War erupted in 1642, pitting royalists against parliamentarians in a conflict that would reshape English government forever. Oliver Cromwell's new model army, with its disciplined soldiers and radical religious fervor, proved decisive. The execution of Charles I in 1649 shocked Europe and established England as a republic for the first and only time in its history. The Commonwealth period under Cromwell saw England become a major European power. Cromwell's military campaigns in Ireland and Scotland brought the entire British Isles under English control, while his navy dominated the seas and challenged Dutch commercial supremacy. However, his increasingly authoritarian rule and the major generals' harsh governance made many yearn for traditional monarchy. The Restoration in 1660 brought Charles II to the throne, ushering in a period of cultural flowering and scientific advancement. The Royal Society, founded in 1660, counted Isaac Newton and Christopher Wren among its members. London was rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1666, with Wren's churches and St. Paul's Cathedral, while the theatre flourished with new plays and the first professional actresses. However, religious and political tensions persisted. The Great Plague of 1665 killed over 100,000 Londoners, while fears of Catholic plots dominated politics. Charles II's secret Catholic sympathies and his brother James's open Catholicism created the first organized political parties, Whigs and Tories, as Parliament sought to exclude James from succession. James II's brief reign from 1685 to 1688 confirmed Protestant fears. His attempts to restore Catholic power, his standing army, and his arbitrary rule convinced both Whigs and Tories that he must be removed. The invitation to Protestant William of Orange to invade led to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which established parliamentary supremacy. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 not only secured Protestant succession, but established the constitutional framework that allowed Britain to become the world's first global superpower. The Bill of Rights and the gradual development of cabinet government created political stability that enabled unprecedented economic growth and imperial expansion. The War of Spanish Succession established Britain as a major European power, with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 gaining Gibraltar, Minorca, and significant territories in North America. More importantly, Britain secured the Asiento, the contract to supply slaves to Spanish America, marking its entry into the lucrative but horrific Atlantic slave trade that would fuel imperial wealth for generations. The 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763 transformed Britain into the world's dominant colonial power. Victory over France brought Canada, Florida, and supremacy in India, while Robert Clive's triumph at Plassey in 1757 laid the foundation for British rule over the subcontinent. The British Empire now spanned continents, supported by the world's most powerful navy. Simultaneously, the Industrial Revolution was transforming Britain itself. Beginning in the textile mills of Lancashire and the iron foundries of the Midlands, steam power, factory production, and improved transportation revolutionized both economy and society. Innovations like the spinning jenny, water frame, and power loom made Britain the workshop of the world. The loss of the American colonies in 1783 initially seemed a devastating blow, but it ultimately redirected British imperial ambitions toward Asia and the Pacific. Captain Cook's voyages opened Australia and New Zealand to British settlement, while the East India Company expanded its control over Indian princely states through a combination of military force and political manipulation. The Napoleonic Wars tested Britain's resolve and resources, but ultimately confirmed its global supremacy. Admiral Nelson's victory at Trafalgar in 1805 secured British control of the seas, while Wellington's triumph at Waterloo in 1815 ended French hegemony in Europe. Britain emerged from these conflicts as the undisputed global superpower. The period also saw significant social changes. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807 marked a moral turning point, though slavery itself persisted in British colonies until 1833. Methodism and evangelical Christianity challenged social complacency, while new ideas about individual rights and representative government gradually gained acceptance. By 1815, Britain stood poised to enter its greatest century of global dominance. The Victorian era marked the zenith of British power and influence. Queen Victoria's 63-year reign transformed Britain into the world's first industrial superpower, ruling an empire that covered a quarter of the globe and governed nearly a quarter of humanity. The Great Exhibition of 1851 in the Crystal Palace showcased British technological and industrial supremacy to the world. Steam railways connected every corner of Britain, while British engineering projects like the Suez Canal and transcontinental railways in India and Canada revolutionized global transportation. Manchester became the world's first industrial city, while London emerged as the unchallenged financial capital of the world. The British Empire reached its territorial zenith during this period. The Indian Mutiny of 1857 led to direct crown rule over the subcontinent, while the scramble for Africa saw Britain acquire vast territories from Egypt to South Africa. The empire upon which the sun never set included Australia, Canada, India, Hong Kong, Singapore, and dozens of smaller territories across every continent. Victorian society underwent profound transformation. The Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, and 1884 gradually extended voting rights, while the rise of organized labor led to the first trade unions and political parties representing working-class interests. Public education became universal, literacy rates soared, and a new middle class emerged with distinct values, emphasizing hard work, moral propriety, and technological progress. The railway age revolutionized British life. Travel that once took days now required only hours, while fresh food could reach urban markets quickly. This transportation revolution facilitated mass communication through the penny post and telegraph, creating for the first time a truly national consciousness and shared culture across Britain. British cultural influence spread globally through empire, trade, and immigration. English became the language of international commerce and diplomacy, while British legal systems, educational institutions, and parliamentary government provided models for development worldwide. Sports like cricket and football spread throughout the empire, creating lasting cultural connections. However, challenges were emerging by the century's end. Germany's rapid industrialization threatened British economic supremacy, while rising nationalism in Ireland, India, and other colonies questioned imperial legitimacy. The Boer Wars in South Africa revealed the costs and contradictions of empire, while new ideologies like socialism challenged Victorian assumptions about society and government. The Victorian era ended with Britain still the world's greatest power, but clouds were gathering that would soon challenge this supremacy in the unprecedented catastrophe of the First World War. The First World War shattered the certainties of the Victorian age and marked the beginning of Britain's slow decline from global supremacy. Over 900,000 British and Empire troops died in the conflict, while the war's enormous cost left Britain deeply in debt to the United States, marking the shift in global economic power across the Atlantic. The interwar period saw Britain struggling to maintain its global position amid economic depression and rising challenges from Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union. The General Strike of 1926 reflected deep social tensions, while the Irish War of Independence led to partition and the creation of the Irish Free State, the first major loss of imperial territory. The Second World War tested Britain's resolve to its limits. Standing alone against Nazi Germany after the fall of France in 1940, Britain's survival hung in the balance during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. Winston Churchill's leadership inspired not just Britain, but the free world, while the Royal Navy's protection of Atlantic convoys kept the lifeline to America open. Victory in 1945 came at an enormous cost. Britain was virtually bankrupt, its cities bombed, and its global position superseded by the United States and Soviet Union. The Labour government under Clement Attlee created the welfare state and the National Health Service, transforming British society, but also began the rapid dismantling of the empire that financial necessity made inevitable. The end of empire began with Indian independence in 1947, though partition into India and Pakistan resulted in massive population transfers and communal violence that killed hundreds of thousands. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked Britain's final humiliation as a global power, when American pressure forced withdrawal from Egypt, demonstrating Britain's dependence on its former colony. Decolonization accelerated through the 1960s as African colonies gained independence, often following violent struggles like the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. By 1970, the empire had largely disappeared, replaced by the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent nations that maintained cultural and economic ties, but no political subordination. Domestically, Britain underwent profound social changes. Immigration from former colonies, particularly the Caribbean and Indian subcontinent, created a multicultural society that challenged traditional notions of British identity. The 1960s brought cultural revolution with the Beatles, fashion innovations, and social liberation that made London the centre of global youth culture. Economic decline paralleled imperial retreat. By the 1970s, Britain was often called the sick man of Europe, struggling with inflation, industrial unrest, and political instability. The three-day week, coal strikes, and IMF bailout in 1976 seemed to confirm Britain's relegation to a secondary power, setting the stage for the dramatic changes of the Thatcher era. 1979 marked a revolutionary transformation in British history. Margaret Thatcher's election ushered in an era of radical change. Privatization, deregulation, and confrontation with trade unions dismantled decades of post-war consensus. Britain was reasserting itself as a major economic power. The 1982 Falklands War demonstrated Britain's continued ability to project military power globally. Meanwhile, financial deregulation transformed London into a world-leading financial centre. As the Cold War ended, Britain played a crucial role in German reunification, while maintaining its characteristic skepticism toward European integration. John Major's government steered Britain through economic recovery and initiated the Northern Ireland peace process. This culminated in the historic Good Friday Agreement of 1998, largely ending decades of sectarian conflict. Tony Blair's new Labour government modernised Britain's economy and society from 1997 to 2010. Despite controversial support for the Iraq War, his administration achieved sustained economic growth, constitutional reform, and improved public services. The 2008 financial crisis exposed Britain's economic vulnerabilities, leading to austerity under David Cameron's leadership. Growing tensions between Britain's global aspirations and European integration culminated in the 2016 Brexit referendum, a vote that would fundamentally reshape Britain's relationship with Europe and its place in the world. From a small island nation that once ruled a quarter of the world, Britain's journey through modern times tells a story of transformation. The Thatcher era reshaped the nation's economic landscape, while the 1990s saw Britain embrace a new European identity. But beneath the surface, questions of sovereignty and identity continued to simmer. Then came Brexit, a decision that split the nation and challenged Britain's place in the global order. The negotiations revealed deep divisions within British society, testing the very fabric of democracy. The COVID-19 pandemic further strained these bonds, exposing inequalities that had long lurked beneath the surface. Yet Britain's influence endures. London remains a global financial hub, while British universities and cultural exports, from the Premier League to the BBC, continue to shape world culture. The Commonwealth connects 54 nations, while a permanent UN Security Council seat ensures Britain's diplomatic voice is heard. Modern Britain stands as a testament to both the possibilities and limitations of national power. It's a story of adaptation and resilience, where a former imperial power has reinvented itself through soft power, financial services, and cultural influence, proving that in our interconnected world, true strength lies not in dominion, but in the ability to evolve.